The marginal revolution, the rise of neoclassical economic price theory, is able for the first time to provide a reliable account of the relationship between prices and values. This revolution is an event of the first order in the history of law and justice because it's capable of explaining how markets actually work. And so we need to consider the consequences of this revolution, its implications for a theory of justice. The marginal revolution is a radical change in the understanding of value. An ancient tradition, going back to Aristotle and running through his medieval successors, and the classical economists, from Smith to Marx, had all tried to explain how prices worked. And they had tried to explain how something got its value. And their theories of value were all grounded in the idea that value was objective. Whether it was usefulness or whether it was labor, something had an objective, quantifiable value. And this is embodied, for instance, in ideas of a just price, that there is a natural price for something. What the marginal revolution does is reorient the relationship between prices and values by removing any idea that values are objective, that they are somehow neutral or independent of individual preferences. The marginal revolution that is instigated by Jevons says that the price of something comes from its marginal utility, that the price of something, in other words, comes from the amount of happiness, and he means it in the sense of Bentham, from the amount of pleasure that something adds. In other words, something's market value comes only from the amount of pleasure that it adds to an individual. So there's a complete destruction of this idea that something has a natural or an objective value, and instead locates values in the interplay between something's scarcity and its costs and something's ability to satisfy individual preferences. So note several features and possible implications of the marginal revolution and its theory of prices. One is that something's market value comes from its subjective value in terms ultimately that reduce to the pleasure of consumers. Two, it ultimately assumes that individuals are self-interested actors. And so it draws on a deep tradition that goes back to Thomas Hobbes and sees people as machines that are pursuing pleasure, that pursue their own individual well-being. And it draws out this strand and places that kind of individual at the center of its theory. And so at the center of neoclassical price theory is the maximizing individual who pursues his or her self-interest to try to maximize his or her utility. So maximization and subjective values are essential to this theory. Note also two possible implications of it. One is a kind of implicit utilitarianism, an argument that says that markets allow people's preferences to be satisfied efficiently. And so think back to the example of the book that R.D. Jevons had encountered as a child. People will labor because something is valuable. Neoclassical price theory can explain markets and prices as efficient incentives that cause behavior that will ultimately satisfy people's preferences. So think of it in these terms. Why are doctor salaries so high? Why are doctor salaries so high? Is it because doctors are useful? Is it because doctors work hard? No. That would be a use value or a labor value. The reason why doctors are highly paid is because the commodity that they produce, medical care, has a certain market value. And that is determined by the equilibrium between supply and demand. The supply is limited because it takes a high level of intelligence and a hard amount of work to become a doctor. And the demand is determined by how much people want more medical care. And people value it highly. They prefer to have very good medical care. And so there's an argument that is in some ways implicit in the neoclassical understanding of prices, which seems to say that it creates an efficient system of incentives if we want to satisfy people's preferences, if we want to allow people to maximize their utility. Because what does the high price of a doctor's salary do? It incentivizes people to become doctors. And so it's like the fish and the boats. People pursue an activity because it's valuable, because it has a high market price. What would happen in a society if doctors were paid $30,000 and janitors were paid $150,000? What would the smartest and most capable people want to become? They would become janitors. But instead, people prefer additional excellent medical care over additional excellent janitorial services. And that is the argument that's implicit in neoclassical price theory, that it's a utilitarian way of maximizing the satisfaction of people's preferences. And finally, note another possible implication. The idea that, in fact, people should be allowed to choose their ends. They should be allowed to choose their preferences. There's something in this sense that is liberal and individualistic. The world that is imagined in neoclassical economic thought, the economic thought that comes to dominate after the Marginal Revolution, imagines individuals as free, individual, maximizing agents with the ability to form contracts at their will to maximize the satisfaction of their preferences. And so in this sense, it's not only utilitarian, but it's also liberal, in the sense that it says that people are agents who are free to choose their own ends, and they ought to be free, because values are ultimately subjective, and there's no other way of actually determining the value of something other than letting people choose which ends they wish to satisfy, what their subjective preferences are. And so that is the legacy of the Marginal Revolution. And its consequences for a theory of justice are profound, because it can say that the price for some good is simply an equilibrium of how much of it there is between the scarcity and cost of something and how much demand, how much people want it because they want to satisfy their individual pleasures.